All right, well, we're back. So we talked a little bit about the physiological arousal that occurs with emotions. Let's talk a little bit about how an emotional stimulus enters our brain and then where it goes for processing and that process, the cognitions and stuff. So we're starting to realize that our brain really has two pathways for processing any kind of information. Certainly that's true for emotional information. We have the sort of non-conscious part of our brain, which is depicted on the left, what we call the speedy or low road. The stimulus comes in through the eyes, goes to the thalamus, because that's where all sensory information goes first, is to the thalamus. And then the thalamus just sends it directly to the amygdala in the low road response. It never goes up to the cortex. And so the person can react very instinctively when you have this low road kind of processing. It goes directly to, in the case of the amygdala, this is a limbic system structure. This is a part of the brain that we share with dogs and lizards and birds and all sorts of other creatures that have spinal cords. So this is oftentimes referred to as the reptilian brain. It's referred to as the midbrain. You may have heard it called a lot of different things. I'm going to call it the limbic system because that's sort of the most modern term. So the limbic system is it can do a lot of things completely on its own without conferring with the cerebral cortex, the higher order part of our brains. And so in this case, we've got a fear stimulus that the person is seeing. It's entering through their eyes. It lands in the thalamus and immediately gets sent to the amygdala, which is the part of our brain that we think is largely responsible for fear responses. And it can cause you to react in some kind of way that indicates that you're experiencing fear. You'll notice in this person's face that the eyebrows are up, the lids are up, the mouth is open. These are a lot of the expressions that you would expect to see in a person who's experiencing fear. You might see in the body that they are maybe crouching or they are frozen. And by crouching, I don't mean low to the ground. I mean like their knees are kind of flexed, sort of ready if they need to run, right? They may have their hands maybe in fists or closer to their bodies, sort of in preparation to run or to fight. And these all happen just completely automatically. There was no thought that went into this. This is sort of the instinctual thing that the body does in response to this kind of fear message that it's getting from the amygdala. So anytime that you sort of react without really thinking about it, that's probably this pathway. Now on the right-hand side, you have the thinking high road version of the brain. So we have, again, the fear stimulus coming in through the eyes, landing in the thalamus and being sent to the amygdala. And it may send an immediate fear, it probably will send an immediate fear response out to the body. And so like all the things that I mentioned for the left-hand picture is probably happening on the right-hand side too. And it's happening completely unconsciously and without intent and very quickly, like within milliseconds, these responses are happening. Meanwhile, the information can be sent also from the thalamus, but now back to maybe the visual cortex for processing, what does this thing that I'm seeing really mean, right? When we're looking at the low road on the left, the fear stimulus is being processed exactly for what it is, like for the elements that are being sent to the eyes and nothing further. On the right-hand side, those elements now are being sent back to the visual cortex to be compared to things that are already known, so then inferences can be drawn. What is that object? What is this thing I'm detecting? Is it something I should be afraid of? So it goes first to the visual cortex for comparison to known things. And then the visual cortex sends it up to the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that makes judgments and decides on plans and decides what I should do next. And so the prefrontal cortex now is going to decide, should I support this initial fear response and go ahead and send more information to the amygdala? You know what? You were right to be having that first initial response. This is terrifying. I'm scared. Let's go. Or it might say, oh, no. You misinterpreted that big, shaggy, black-furred animal as a bear, but it's actually the neighbor's dog. It's fine. Relax. Now the parasympathetic nervous system can kick in and we can, start repairing this initial fear response that we had. So the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that will be able to impose, a conscious plan, a decision. If you've ever seen, like in a movie, The script will tell the actor to immediately start solving a problem. Immediately, I was just watching Stranger Things, and season 4 just came out, so we watched it, and it's been a while since season 3 had been out, so we already were a little bit confused anyway, so we decided let's go back and watch from season 1. And one of the things I noticed in season 1 was that there was a lot of situations where something very scary was happening, and the characters would do a lot of yelling at each other. What is it? What's happening? What is it? Like immediately. And in reality, that's not how most of us respond to really scary things, like a Demogorgon coming out from the upside down. So if you've watched Stranger Things, I legit have watched it. Usually you don't have that kind of wherewithal that quickly to respond like that. In reality, most people are pretty silent during a fearful situation that's novel, that they don't have training for or experience with. They're usually pretty quiet because they can't even get themselves to like formulate a thought, let alone enunciate something. They might, a lot of times people are surprised when there's a tragedy of some sort that people don't scream in reality. You see it on movies, but in reality, people don't usually scream. And that's because there's like, your fear response oftentimes involves sort of paralyzing you, not letting all your air out in a scream. And so it's really uncommon to see a scream. I personally gasp a lot. Like if I'm out on a hike and it feels like I'm slipping, I'll gasp. And my kids are always like, how do you get a gasp out so fast? And what they're asking is, usually when you're scared, you can't get that out. The truth is I gasp not because I'm scared, but because I'm more startled. And I know I'm not really going to fall, but I'm like, I could have fallen, right? And so I think that's why I can get a gasp out so quickly, is because I'm not really scared. I'm more just sort of startled and enunciating it. You can't really respond that quickly. It takes a second for that second stage for the information to go from the thalamus to the higher order parts of the brain up to the prefrontal cortex to then devise a plan like let's scream or let's run or let's ask somebody, what's that? Or, it takes a second to get it up to the prefrontal cortex to even start to think about what the plan should be. So it's really easy to sort of watch people in real life situations. Maybe you've gotten to see a person on a closed camera. I see it on YouTube all the time, CCTV, you'll never believe this. And they caught it on tape. And there's a moment where you'll see people sometimes get frozen and they don't know what to do, it looks like. And it's not that they don't know what to do. It's even more like they don't know what's happening. And that's the sort of fear response that we see in people. So in the example that we're seeing here with fear as an example, you can really get some insight into why there's that delay. It can be milliseconds long. It could maybe be a couple of seconds long. If you freeze immediately, that might be protective for a second. If the Demogorgon is looking for you, a lot of times it cues on movement, right? So if you freeze for a second, it may not see you at all. But once it's seen you, you better be formulating a plan, right? Because it's now, okay, it's seen me. I need to move. And now if you're still frozen, that's going to be maladaptive. So like we were talking about earlier in the last segment, one of the functions of emotions is to help ensure your survival. So fear motivates you to run away from the Demogorgon, right? Happiness maybe brings you together with other people who are sharing that emotion. If you're feeling sad, it can elicit support from the people around you to help get you out of that sad mood. Like this is the benefit of the emotions. The problem with sort of us seeing a lot of scripted versions of how people react in emotional situations is that in real life, when we see people taking a second to consider, well, how am I feeling? What is this stimulus? What's the proper response? Like when it takes people a second, we kind of feel like, I don't know, maybe they're not really feeling the emotion, or they're trying to clean up their response for our purposes, or some other thing that's probably not what's really going on. So just keep that in mind, that there is this just natural delay in that thinking high road. And so a lot of times we're busy having our natural response, our sort of instinctual response to whatever the stimulus is. And then we can start to correct or expand or develop our response once we go through the thinking high road. All right. Sorry. So theories of emotion. Of all the theories we're going to talk about, they do share some themes, like some consistencies across these theories. There are two major questions that all of the theories attempt to answer. One is, does the physiological arousal that accompanies the emotion come before or after the emotional feelings? So are you physiologically aroused and then you feel the emotion, or do you experience the emotion and then you experience the physiological arousal? And the other question is, how do feelings and cognitions interact? Like, how do these emotions interact with our cognitions? So we have several theories. This is very common in psychology to have a bunch of different theories, each of them sort of having some support in some ways and then not support in other parts of it. So that's how these theories continue to exist side by side, is that some of them, they each explain part of our experiences. Let's start with the granddaddy of all of them, the original theory of emotion, which is the James Lange theory. The James in this title is William James. So, very early on, 1890 American psychologist. Just to remind you, I'm going to have this little model that reminds you that emotions made up of physiological activation, expressive behavior, and conscious experience. So that'll always be on the left. All right, so the James Lange theory. Okay, let's imagine, I'm going with fear for some reason as my consistent emotion today, so just go with me. And I apologize to anybody who's terrified of snakes. I should have warned you there's going to be a snake picture coming up here. But let's say that you see a snake and it leads you to have a response. According to James Lange, you've got the stimulus leading to autonomic nervous system arousal, which then leads to the emotion, in this case, fear. And so the way that James explained it is he said, I feel fear because I tremble. So because there's a snake here and I'm trembling, I'm going to infer that what I'm experiencing is emotion. One of the things that James Lange talked about, or at least James talked about that I know for sure, is that because all emotions experience physiological arousal, that you wouldn't be able to tell them apart just by what they do to your heart rate and your respiration and things like that. More modern research that has better technology for detecting these kinds of responses show some differences between emotions. But he thought it was really critical that in the face of this stimulus, I'm having this physiological response. That must mean I'm experiencing this emotion. All right, so what support do we have for the James Lange theory? So here's an interesting little experiment. They glued golf tees to people's eyebrows, right, those center eyebrows, and told them that their job was to try and get the tips of the golf tees to touch. So you see that her doing that on the right. Interestingly, as she's making that angry face, it's causing her lips to thin and turn down a little bit. And so you're seeing some other aspects of anger, like you see her eyelids are down a little bit over her eyes in a way that they aren't in the left-hand picture. So you're seeing some facial expressions associated with anger besides just the bringing together of the tips of the golf tee. But what they find is that after people have completed this assignment, they express greater anger on little assessments of anger than they did prior to the golf tee exercise. So holding your face in that posture tends to lead you to have the sensation that you're experiencing that emotion. They've also tested it on happiness. They had a group of college students. The job was to hold the pencil in your mouth without letting your lips touch the pencil. So that means you're basically holding it in a grimace, right? Kind of a smile. If you've ever done this, it's really hard not to drool while you're doing it and things. But they found that after people held a pencil in their mouth like this, that they experienced greater happiness. So again, it's like if your body is experiencing something, you're going to infer that it must be that you're experiencing the emotion that goes with that body posture. They've even done it a little bit more scientifically, where you don't have to, hold a pencil in your mouth, where they have this little device that they tape it to your cheeks, and then it lifts your cheeks and your mouth up in it's sort of like a smile. And people who have experienced that tend to show greater happiness after the exercise than they were displaying prior to it. So these kinds of experiences, these kinds of studies where you have people hold just the physical posture of the that's typically associated with that emotion, now they experience that emotion at a higher rate, kind of supports the notion that, I feel fear because I tremble, rather than I tremble because I feel fear. So that's my support for the James Lange theory. In the next segment, let's pick up with the Cannon-Bard theory. So I will see you in the next section.